Well, I think the effect of Freud, even today in the 21st century, remains profound. When you begin to look at even the simplest kinds of behaviors, like when somebody says, "What did you mean by that?" That, I think, directly relates to Freud's psychology and his notion of the unconscious. The fact that we're not aware of our motives, we're not aware of our behaviors, we're not aware of our speech patterns, and we've come to doubt our motivations, intentions, and impulses, even in the 21st century, more than 100 years after Freud wrote his first book. I came to the study of Freud primarily through an interest in humor, and Freud wrote an incredibly important book on jokes called in English, Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious. And in that book, he addresses joking and humor more generally from a number of different perspectives. Whether you agree with all of his conclusions is another matter, but most of his perspectives and his questions remain relevant. And in the course of once teaching a class on humor at the graduate level, I casually mentioned to to the class as a whole, somebody ought to look at Freud's jokes in relationship to his personality. After all, he was a joke teller. And the idea actually caught me. And a little later on, I started to do work on Freud's jokes, those that were pretty much his personal jokes, which were Jewish jokes, and how they articulated with his biography, with his letters, with his relationships, and things like that. Well, a couple of things. One is Freud confessed, and he actually used that word in his letter, to making a collection of deeply profound Jewish stories, meaning jokes, at the very same time he was doing his own self-analysis. The very same time. Nobody pointed that out before, to my knowledge. And it seemed to me a kind of a striking thing. Why is he collecting Jewish jokes, calling them profound, deeply significant, at the very same time he's undergoing his self-analysis that's going to give rise to, his whole new theoretical psychology? Second, Freud often identified with some of his joke characters. So, one stock character in the jokes is Itzik. Well, he often would say, I feel like Itzik, who, and then he would tell a brief joke. Or he would say, I feel like the schnorrer, who. So there's this kind of leitmotif of Freud identifying with his joke characters. And even his disciples commented regularly on his propensity to tell jokes, and usually Jewish jokes. And in fact, in his book on jokes, he says, you'll excuse me if I use examples that kind of have made me laugh the most. What are those examples? His Jewish jokes. So there was a confluence of forces here that suggested that jokes were more than idle kind of entertainments, but rather held some kind of deep significance and had some real connection to Freud as a person. Well, in the book I go through several themes that his jokes cluster about. One would be schnorrer jokes, and looking at Freud's poverty in his early years. He was constantly borrowing from his friends. He was going into debt to Breuer, to his friend Hammerschlag, to all his fellow students. And he would do something that the schnorrer would do in the jokes. He would borrow money so he could lend it to someone else. So you begin to see certain real connections between the themes and characters in Freud's jokes and Freud's own particular circumstances. Marriage jokes, the Shadchan jokes, these were also connected to Freud's relationship with Martha, his bride-to-be, and eventually his wife. So traveling jokes, and Freud was a traveler. There are a number of things that one could look at. So as it progressed, it seems that all the themes of Freud's jokes held some real connection to him as a person and to his circumstances in life. To give you one example of a joke, and it's an interesting one because it's a Jewish joke, but it's one of the few Jewish jokes he doesn't explicitly identify as being Jewish. And it's about this baroness, the wife of a baron, who's about to give birth. And the doctor and the husband are sitting out in the living room talking, and all of a sudden they hear her exclaim in German, "Oh, the pain! Oh, the pain!" And the husband gets up, is concerned. The doctor says, "No, it's not time yet." And a little while later, she exclaims in French, "Oh, I am suffering, I am suffering." And the husband gets up again, and the doctor says, "No, it's not time yet." And then sometime later, they hear her exclaim in Yiddish, "Oi, weh geschrien." The doctor says, "Now it's time." The idea being, of course, is that this baroness is Jewish. She has been overlaid, right, by the civilization of Gentile society. She knows German, she knows French, but these are not Mama Lashon. And only when real pain comes do you express yourself in your real language and reveal yourself to be Jewish. So here you have a kind of a joke that I think relates to Freud. Of course, he was perfectly comfortable in Austrian society, Austrian-Hungarian society, at least up to the First World War. He spoke perfectly good German. He wrote perfectly good German. The only prize he won in Austria was for his literary merit, not for his psychological theories. And to a great extent, he felt like this hidden Jew, although he didn't try to hide his identity ever. And he was deeply conflicted about being a Jew in a society that didn't respect them, didn't reward them, and basically didn't like them. He used the joke. He used the joke in his book. I don't know how he told it or who he told it to. We don't really have anybody sitting there writing down his jokes as he told them and describing them as an anthropologist or a folklorist might do who was studying jokes. All we have is the textual evidence that remain in his books, in his letters, and in the recollections of his disciples in their own memoirs. I don't think anyone can do serious work on humor and not have read that book. It's a book, Freud's Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious is a very important book, and no one who wants to do research on humor can do that research without having read it. That doesn't mean that they're going to accept his theories, but this is really the first comprehensive approach to the study of jokes and humor more generally. He looks at the technical apparatus of jokes. How do jokes work? He identifies the purposes or the motives of jokes. He actually engages in an analysis of the interaction that goes on when people tell jokes. He tries to differentiate between jokes, the comic, and humor, which was a distinction that's not so relevant to us today, but was much more salient back in the 19th and early 20th century. So it's a book that's filled with very good ideas, although they may not necessarily be the ideas that Freud would have wanted promulgated after him. Freud, at the beginning of that book, makes an analogy between jokes and dreams. He argues that the techniques of jokes are very similar to the techniques of dreams. That is, you find condensation. Certain different ideas are condensed together, as they might be in a dream. There's displacement. One idea is suddenly diverted to another idea that seems unrelated. Things are represented indirectly. And this, of course, gave him the idea that, oh, I've written a book on dreams, and jokes are clearly related to this. And people have seized on this and wrongly assumed that you can just deal with jokes in the same way that Freud dealt with dreams, but you can't. Because Freud also said something else that's exceedingly important. Dreams have no intelligibility. When you dream, you don't know what they mean. You don't know what they're saying. Only through psychoanalysis can you find out what they're saying. But jokes are the opposite. They're highly intelligible. If you don't understand them, there's no joke. So there's also a very big difference between jokes and dreams that signifies an important theoretical difference that's often missed by people who simply assume that understanding Freud's work on dreams leads them to understand Freud's work on jokes. Well, anyone who's a good joke teller gains in their ability to socialize and to seem pleasant and improve the nature of intercourse. And any joke teller who's good does that. Freud also used jokes in a way that some other people might not. He often used them as glosses. What I mean by that is they weren't told for their own sake, but told to illuminate a point that he was making. And in fact, in his psychoanalytic writings, you'll find when jokes appear in his writings, they're often to illustrate some kind of psychological point. When he wants to talk about egoism, he says, oh, it's like the peasants, the French peasants, where the husband says to the wife, if one of us dies, I shall move to Paris. And he uses that, to illustrate the idea of egoism, because here the guy can't imagine that it would be anyone else but his wife who might die first. So that kind of unconscious egoism was illustrated by a joke, that would be one example. When he wanted to make a point about how the individual is driven by forces that are not under that person's control, the deep psychological forces of the id, or what came to be called the id, das Es. He talked about Itzik the horseman, who's on a horse riding, galloping through the town, and somebody shouts to Itzik, Itzik, where are you going? And Itzik says, don't ask me, ask the horse. Again, to illustrate his point about not being in control of our own motivations. Freud has made us doubt ourselves. He's one of the figures, a prime figure, but not the only figure, that has thrust doubt into the world in which we live. We have to remember that Freud came out of what we might today call a Victorian culture and Victorian sensibility. Freud was working in a milieu originally in which morality, which underpins society, was based upon a good heart, noble sentiments, affection. These were the things bound together basically in a Christian family, which was a bulwark against the forces of capitalism. And what did Freud's psychology do? He destroyed all of that. Again, not the only one. The forces of modernism were much larger than Freud, but Freud had an enormous impact. And in looking at the Victorian situation, even the Victorian family, all of a sudden the love of the family was basically motivated by the desire for incestuous relations and murder. All the Victorian sentiments were reduced to these terrible, awful, even evil motivations. And with that, you had the shattering of Victorian sensibility, a widespread shattering that we haven't recovered from today and probably will not. There are still elements in our society of Victorian sensibility, and you can see it in a lot of Hollywood movies. But the fact is, the first incursions were occurring in psychology, Freud, in art, and in anthropology, who were bringing alternate ways of viewing the world in front of people in Europe and America. With regard to anthropology, the early anthropology of the first decades of the 20th century, you think of Margaret Mead and her important book, Coming of Age in Samoa. There have been some serious questions raised about her field techniques and her data. But nevertheless, she had read Freud. Freud came to America in 1909, and Franz Boas was at those lectures that Freud gave, and other psychologists and important figures. Mead shocked American society by suggesting that adolescence was not a particularly... Mead shocked America, for example, with her early book, Coming of Age in Samoa, where she described the sexual practices on Samoa and suggested that, in fact, adolescence was not necessarily a turbulent time, that sexuality was engaged in freely. There were no downsides to all of this sexual play that went on. This was a shock because it stood contrary to everything that had been assumed by American Victorian society and was so contrary to American Victorian values. Mead was strongly influenced by Freud. The very fact that she was looking at adolescent sexuality would not have happened had there been no Freud. She would never have thought to examine the question of adolescent sexuality without the kind of influence that Freud had. And we have to remember that Freud's biggest audience was America. It wasn't Europe. It wasn't even his own Austria. He had more influence in America, probably, than anywhere else in the world in the initial decades of his theorizing. To a certain extent, there's probably a connection between the 60s and the hippies. And the hippies, of course, were also reacting against a kind of bourgeois conception of sexuality. Of course, that bourgeois conception is a very old conception that's found in the Judeo-Christian ethic. Both the rabbis and the priests were busy suppressing sexuality. The body was evil. And the whole purpose of an individual who was religious in any way was to keep those sexual forces under control. Freud naturalized those forces. He said they were simply a part of what every human being is. He was not personally in favor of sexual liberation, where everything should run wild, but inevitably, that was probably the logical endpoint of some of his theorizing that was realized back in the 60s. And the 60s point of view towards sexuality was largely that what had gone on before was hypocrisy. And to a great extent, it was hypocrisy. People didn't talk about sex, but they certainly had it. If you go back to the Victorians in England and America, you didn't even refer to the legs of a table, because to say the word legs was to conjure up the image of a woman's legs, which were covered. So you have this situation of severe repression. At the same time, great interest and pursuit of prostitutes. So there was this kind of hypocritical point of view. The Victorian gentleman may visit prostitutes, but you never spoke about it openly. So the hypocrisy had always been there. People denied their sexuality, at least in public. And the 60s, I think, to a certain extent, rebelled against that hypocrisy. Well, Freud's theories put sex and aggression, not only sex, and in some ways aggression may have been more fundamental, but sex more salient, in the front of and center of his theorizing. Freud never pretended to be a sexual liberationist. And Freud, of course, was not the only one to talk about sex in that period. And he cites others who were interested in sexual deviation and sexual practices, people who had written books on this that Freud made use of. So he wasn't out to realize some kind of way of life for himself through his theorizing. But he was aware that there was a repression and suppression of the topic of sex. And in fact, jokes were one way to get around that suppression. Because when you told a sexual joke, you didn't realize until the punchline that it was a sexual joke. And by that time, it was too late. So the joke was a way of evading a kind of social censorship that existed and allowed people to bring up the topic of sex even in polite society or politer society. Those jokes might not have been told about women, but men told them all the time. And it was understood, unlike a dream, you knew that a sexual joke was about sex. A sexual dream you might not know was about sex necessarily, but a joke you did know. And those kinds of things were used. And he argued that the joke was essentially a mask to allow you to express ideas that would have been unacceptable in polite society. A sexual joke that Freud mentioned, not a Jewish joke, was that, and he had to explain it because most people wouldn't get it. In fact, I wouldn't have gotten it had he not explained it. And he said, a wife is like an umbrella. Sometimes you take a cab. And what it means is that a wife is like an umbrella. It protects you against mild downpours. That is, mild downpours of sexual impulses. You can satisfy yourself sexually with your wife when the urge seizes you. But when the real urge seizes you, you need a cab. That is, a public vehicle. That is, a prostitute. So this was a joke that Freud explained and used in his book on jokes. But such a condensed joke, such a hard joke to decode, that he felt it necessary to explain it in some detail. I would imagine that most people would agree in confidence that they can't have the same sex with their wives that they can with another woman. You know, it reminds me of a joke that Freud didn't use, and that was the joke that these older couple, are having sex together in bed, and nobody's getting aroused, and nobody's reaching a climax, and the wife says to the husband, so you couldn't think of anyone either. So, I mean, jokes recognize realities and use those realities, even though they tend to be unspoken realities. Freud wasn't liberated, nor would he have claimed to be. He wasn't like Marx. Marx not only was a theoretician, but he was involved in a movement. Freud was a theoretician, and the movement that he established was a psychological and therapeutic movement, but it wasn't a liberation movement. That wasn't his concern. Well, Freud's psychological theory is a theory of the individual. However, his theory, he would argue, applies to all individuals. So it's focused on the individual, but it is not limited to an individual or any particular group of individuals. So he claims it to be a universal theory. Whether it is or not, a universally applicable theory. Whether it is or not is another question. Freud did write about culture. But as a doctor, most of his data comes from his patients. These are individuals, and consequently, he's inspired by certain kinds of symptoms and certain kinds of results he gets in therapy by his contact with these particular individuals. So he doesn't have a laboratory, he doesn't have a bunch of psychology undergraduate students to run tests on. He's purely working out of his office. Nevertheless, he wrote some very important books on culture in general. For example, he wrote Totem and Taboo about religion, in which he argued that basically, among other things, religion was nothing more than a group neurosis. A very important idea. He wrote about religion again in The Future of an Illusion, in which he maintained basically that the idea of God is nothing more than an idealization of the parents. He wrote Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, which was about mob phenomena and how people come to follow certain leaders in political or religious movements. So he had his eye on the culture as well as the individual, but his inspiration primarily came from the individual that he saw in his offices, and also from, very importantly, not only the scientific literature, but also literature itself. Fiction had a very profound influence on Freud. As someone who has written about jokes, I have used ideas that come out of Freud's work, which is not to say that I have adopted his orientation, his theoretical orientation in the analysis of jokes. But in the course of discussing things like jokes and other things, he's incredibly insightful. You know, you can read a lot of important theorists today who don't seem to have a lot of insight. They don't show you something you didn't see before. Freud is always showing you something you hadn't seen before, things that you hadn't even thought about before. One of the most prominent folklorists, which I count myself a folklorist, was Alan Dundas. Alan Dundas was one of the few folklorists to make extensive use of Freud's work. And one of the interesting things about Alan Dundas, about whom I wrote critiques and book reviews, is he always saw things that nobody else saw. And when you see things that nobody else sees, you define the problem that you have to solve differently. It's not the problem you thought you had to solve, it's actually a different problem. And to that extent, Freud defines things differently for us and sets us a different set of problems than what we originally thought the problems were. The motives of sex and aggression are old. Freud didn't discover sex and aggression. It's not very difficult to go back in time and see that people were in fact understanding human behavior in terms of both sex and aggression. You go back to Helen of Troy, for example. It doesn't take much to see that sex might have been a motivator there. And the response to the seizing of Helen of Troy was a massive aggression by the Greeks against the Trojans. So the idea that sex and aggression are motives is not new. What was new with Freud, of course, is that sex and aggression are constant elements in the way we function. And that these are motives that are not conscious to us and nevertheless direct our behavior in a whole bunch of ways. That's not all he had to say, but he made sex and aggression not matters of epic drama, but of everyday individual drama. And that was a revelation that has not left us. It has not left us. It's a constant factor in our consideration of what we do. Another example in which Freud had a profound effect on our sense of the world is what used to be attributed in the past to demons, to witchcraft, were now completely transformed within his psychology. All of these things now made great sense from the point of view of a psychoanalytic psychology, where before you had to leave them to alien spirits. In the same way that Darwin kind of subdued the influence of gods and demons in shaping the species of the world, Freud subdued many of the gods and demons that shaped human behavior. And what previously had been thought of as a dybbuk was now something related to a deep conflict within the psychology of the individual. You know, what was thought of as a demon or a dybbuk that was used to account for wild behavior of an individual, just insane behavior or aggressive behavior, was now domesticated within Freud's psychoanalytic psychology. And we understood something that we didn't understand before, in the same way that Darwin understood how species could come into being without having to attribute it to any kind of supernatural force. Why is Freud hated by so many people? Well, I'm not quite sure how many people really hate him. And that there's been an assault on Freud for quite some time is fairly evident if you read the book review sections of major newspapers. There are probably a couple of reasons. First of all, any major theory comes under attack. I don't care what the theory is or whose theory it is. It's eventually going to be attacked. And people get status for attacking powerful, comprehensive theories. So that's one thing. But Freud's theory was different than, let's say, Einstein's theory of relativity or Darwin's theory of evolution, although Darwin came in for attacks not so personally, but certainly for his theory. And Freud's theory was an invasion of privacy. Freud's theory wasn't simply a statement about the nature of the human condition. It was an intrusion into the psychological processes, the processes of mind, the processes of thinking that each individual had, which challenged our sense of ourselves and how we operate, what our goals are, and what our methods are for achieving those goals. In this day and age, we have to recognize that our patterns of speech are influenced by Freud. The word unconscious, repression, ambivalence, rationalization, defense mechanism, ego, these were all terms that essentially Freud introduced into our vocabulary and which we can no longer escape. They're simply part of our thinking. And it's hard to get through a serious conversation without eventually falling into a term or two that he really made central in conceptualizing the way humans think and work. My sense would be that the preoccupation that adolescents, for example, have today, and young adults with themselves, photographing themselves, documenting themselves, isn't directly attributed to Freud. Freud, of course, was introduced another word. He didn't invent the word, but he introduced another word that became important, and that is narcissism. And that is the preoccupation with the self and the promotion of the self. But I don't think Freud is directly responsible for this kind of individual preoccupation with everything that they do and say. After all, Freud did focus on the individual, but each individual had a unique history, true, but that unique history was played out on a common template. That is, we all went through certain stages according to Freud, and that didn't depend on our history per se. We all had parents, and that didn't rest purely on our individual selves. So ultimately, he saw the individual as important. He focused on the individual, but I don't say that he essentially fomented this kind of individualism, which, by the way, is, has been prominent in American culture for a very long time, a very American phenomenon, which may have spread to the rest of the world. If you look at Israel, for example, the ethos of Israel was socialism. The kibbutz, while it wasn't the demographically dominant form of existence, it was the ideological dominant form of existence in the early years of the creation of the State of Israel. That was socialism, not individualism. It was each according to his need, each according to his ability. Now, interestingly, there's an anecdote about Freud, which I like, but I don't know that it's true. After World War I, somebody was explaining to him the communist revolution in Russia. And the person explained that first, all the institutions, all the models, all the positions will be torn down and everything will be destroyed. And then we will build a perfectly just and harmonious society in which all people are equal and everyone gets what they deserve. And Freud said, according to the anecdote, I believe the first part. The point is that the kibbutz was a noble idea and couldn't survive. Economically, it couldn't survive. I was talking to kibbutzniks a couple of weeks ago, saying, we work in the forest and we bring our salaries home. We're building body armor. That's the agricultural ideal. There are the rich kibbutzim now and the poor kibbutzim.
Of course.
And as they said years ago, that socialism can't survive in a sea of capitalism. It may be that socialism can't survive as a societal system. I don't know. Certainly the Russians made a mess of it.